Hey, everybody. Before we get into the show today, Melvin and I would just like to tell you how you can support the show.
Don't forget to leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes, write a written review, and tell a friend.
You can follow us on social media. We're The Life of X on Facebook and Instagram, and at Life of X Podcast on Twitter. We're definitely the most active on Twitter, so you should join us. Follow us there. Retweet our tweets.
And head over to our support page at lifeofxpodcast.com.
There you are going to find several options to support the podcast. The first is audible.com. For those of you who don't know what audible.com is, it is the largest purveyor of audiobooks on the internet. I have personally been using it for years. Many of the books that we have used for the podcast can be found on Audible. If you go through our portal on our page, you will receive a free audiobook when you sign up for a monthly subscription, and they will also kick us a few dollars.
You can also support us by going through our portal to Amazon. If you do that, any purchases that you make, we'll get a small kickback.
We've also added a featured book page to the website. Any of you who are interested in actually purchasing the books that we've used, many of which are fantastic books, you can go through there, and that will route you through our Amazon portal to the Amazon page where you can purchase the books. And so, again, we get a few cents off each purchase. Additionally, we've set up a Patreon page, and for those of you who are unaware of what that is, it is a service wherein patrons can pledge a certain amount of money per episode. So every time Melvin and I release an episode, you would send us $1, $2, whatever you can. We would appreciate anything. We have goals set up. We have different tiers so that we can also reciprocate your generosity.
All your dollars help.
That's right. But again, we would just like to say that the most important thing that you can do is rate, review, and tell a friend. Help get our name out there. All right. Enjoy the show.
Thanks, guys.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name is Arif Jadala.
And I'm Melvin Barnes.
And that makes this The Life of X. Part 3 on our man, Bruce Lee. Now, we left off with Bruce about to break into the film and television industry, just at the Long Beach major karate tournament where he had impressed a lot of people, and now he is ready to break in. One of the ways that karate tournament really set him up for success in terms of trying to break into acting was that one of the people he impressed there was Jay Sebring, right?
Yeah, so Jay is guy in Cali. He's big into martial arts, but his day job is running this like hair salon, where he does hair for all of these important people. And one of his clients was William Dozier, and this is in 1964. And Dozier's, in his chair, and what usually happens at these
getting his hair did
at these salons or barbershops is people talk. And Dozier at the time was working on a series, Charlie Chan, which is about a Chinese detective or something like that. And he's looking to cast another character, and Jay just kind of says hey man, if you're looking for a Chinese guy that can do a little martial arts and stuff, I know the guy for you. His name is Bruce Lee, and I ran into him at a karate tournament earlier in 1964. So Bruce's performance set him up by kind of impressing the right people who could then connect him with other people. And this is all going on unbeknownst to Bruce Lee. Actually, at this time, Bruce, shortly after that, has his first child in February of 1965.
It's Brandon.
Yep, Brandon Lee, the Crow, who we'll talk about a little bit later. So now it's 65. Bruce has got a newborn son. And at age 24, he finds himself in front of a camera, and he's doing his first TV kind of screen test. And I don't know if you guys have seen the screen test. Take the time, if you haven't, to pull it up on YouTube. It's a wonderful screen test. It's actually really entertaining, and certain aspects of it are actually quite funny. So Mr. Dozier, he played a role in kind of organizing shows like Gunsmoke and Perry Mason. So he's been around the block a few times, but what Bruce kind of showed them in that day was really something unique. They asked him a bunch of questions, and, he's talking about yeah, I've got a newborn son, and
I haven't slept in a few days.
Yeah, I haven't slept in a few days. And they ask him to demonstrate some of his martial arts, and it's hilarious because they bring in this guy who looks geriatric, right? They bring in this old guy, and Bruce starts demonstrating some of the techniques because he's like, yeah, it's hard to do just by yourself. So this old guy hobbles onto the camera, and Bruce starts throwing jabs at his face, and he literally can't help himself but to react. He's pulling back 3 seconds after Bruce would have punched him in the face, kicking at his groin. The people there they're pretty impressed, and he breaks down let me tell you about the differences between karate and kung fu. And he's scaring the crap out of this old guy.
Poor old guy.
Yeah, and he really makes a really positive impression on Dozier and everybody else who's taking part in this screen test. And he leaves there knowing that he's done
well.
He'd done well. The screen test goes well. It's great. It's right now it's iconic basically. But unfortunately for Bruce at this time, his father dies. So he has to head back to Hong Kong. And Eric, if you could say a little bit about the exchange that happens when he gets back to Hong Kong.
Yeah, and I will in just a second. But when Bruce leaves to go to Hong Kong, Linda goes to take Brandon to stay with her mom for a little while. And,
yes.
And it just illustrates that her mother was still very unaccepting and cold in my mind. That according to Thomas, when she gets to her mother's house, the first thing she says when she greets her grandson and daughter, she's something like, how could you have done this? It's
yeah,
wow.
It's pretty rough.
Nice, Mom. But anyway, Bruce heads back to Hong Kong, and this is something we've kind of alluded to in an earlier episode, that there's a ritual that more or less that Bruce had to undergo because he had not been present when his father died. And so it was to atone more or less for sin is probably not the right word, but to show how ashamed he was that he hadn't been there when his father died, he had to put on a show of weeping, and throwing himself over I believe it was over the casket or something like that, and crawling back to the door or something along those lines.
Yeah, they, I can't remember that portion of the book with the great detail, but I imagine they would have had a place set up where you can kind of go and pay your respects. I think it may have been in the home, but he had to walk in and you have to show the appropriate levels of grief. And this is all steeped in traditional Chinese culture, in the olden days under the imperial system, if you were part of the literati, and let's say your family member, and really this goes even beyond these learned scholars, but if your family member passed away, your parent, your father, you had a period of time in which you were just supposed to mourn. It was a year. It was a really long time. And so there's influences on how, you're supposed to show that grief. And Bruce, having been absent, just returning back to Hong Kong, he had to show that appropriate level of respect and grief when he got there.
Yeah, and so he does that, and he stays there for a little while to see that his mother is all right, and that the affairs are in order, and everything is set up. And then he heads back to the States, and he eventually gets this call that Charlie Chan had been canned, the series, but that screen test leads to Bruce playing one of his more iconic roles as Kato in the Green Hornet.
Yeah, so they canned the show, Charlie Chan. He never really, he never took part in anything outside of the screen test. But he does get that role, as Eric mentioned, in the Green Hornet as Kato. Now, there's a lot of things going on in Bruce's life at this time. He moves to L.A. in March of 1966 because, he needs to be close to where they're shooting.
Now, hang on. Bruce still doesn't have a whole lot of money, right?
No.
And so he definitely moves into a modest part of L.A., correct?
Right. So he moves into a modest part of LA, but the interesting thing for right now is that he signed on to produce episodes for the Green Hornet, but he's getting $400 an episode. So he's got some more substantial income, right? Yep. So he can get a modest place. He's not going crazy over the top. So Bruce is signed on to get paid about $400 per episode,
which is nice.
I mean, the thing is you don't know how long the show is going to run. But, you can do pretty well with $400 an episode, considering he was getting $4 a week from his students before. And now the Green Hornet, it was originally a radio program that was created in the 1930s by a guy named George W. Trendle. Now, this is the same guy who started the Lone Ranger radio program. And actually, the Lone Ranger, the central character in the Green Hornet, Britt Reed, who is the Green Hornet. He's the nephew of the Lone Ranger. So this is kind of like almost like one of those like DC or like Marvel Universe crossover.
Yeah,
type
it takes
things.
place in the same universe.
Right. And Kato is the Green Hornet, or Britt Reed's chauffeur.
Yeah.
And he wears the kind of iconic, like when they're in their superhero garb, like the chauffeur suit with the hat and the face mask thing that everybody knows when they see it. So according to Thomas, and I have no idea if this is actually 100% true. This is like the first time that Kung Fu is seen on television.
And if it's not the first time, it's definitely like the most noticed.
Widespread kind of exposure at this point in time. And like the crazy thing is Bruce, even in the United States, like Kato is the real star of the show.
I mean, watch some of those episodes. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Oh, neat. Green Hornet with your neat gun, or you can watch Bruce Lee just pick people apart.
Throw darts at people. Like, I mean, there's something different, especially back then, like the fight scenes were just like guys like slugging each other. And Bruce brought something different to the show, and you could definitely see it in how it played out on screen. So like most of the fan mail for that show went to Kato.
Yeah, and it was interesting too, though, that Kato was, not technically the star, but in terms of popularity, he was the most popular. And so you would think that, oh, well, so will Bruce. But you have to think of the fact that Bruce was like really famous behind a mask, more or less.
Yeah, and what's crazy is, so Bruce, to get more money during this, he starts making, obviously, appearances as Kato. And he was charging $1,000 for like a Kato appearance. And, it's one thing Bruce Thomas points out, like he would do all these appearances, but he would put limits on what he would do. Like he's not around, a monkey jumping through hoops, like breaking boards for people. But he'd definitely like go out and do some talks and maybe put on a few demonstrations. But this all kind of bought into this idea that Bruce had about spreading knowledge about Kung Fu. And he really was interested in, at this point in time, like opening a nationwide chain of Kato's martial arts schools. So that's kind of cool. But the show is actually, unfortunately or fortunately, it was short-lived.
Even though it was popular, it didn't get, I don't think it got picked up for a second season, did it?
No, I think it was just one season. So, I mean, it got canned in 67.
Yeah, and they did like, they had a crossover episode with Batman and Robin, and like, I think they had like
yeah,
I think they had like a Christmas special or something like that too. Like even after the show was canceled, like they did a couple of
one-off.
Like cameo type stuff, but it was really short-lived. And again, even though Bruce's character was by far the most popular, he found that his phone really wasn't ringing much afterwards.
He tried to parlay it into some more opportunities, but they didn't seem to be forthcoming right away. And it's interesting about that Batman and Robin crossover episode, because Bruce was prone to playing practical jokes.
Yeah.
Apparently there was one point where he starts just like stalking the guy who played Robin, and was like acting like he was really gonna beat him up.
Yeah, because they were gonna fight on screen.
And I think he was supposed, I don't know, I think they fought to a draw on the screen, but like they were supposed to. He wanted to really like make the Robin guy think that he was gonna kill him. And Robin, it said that he was like running around like, listen, man, it's just a show. Like,
I'm just an actor.
Right, and if you've seen the guy who played Robin, like, my God, like he looked frail.
He looked like just an actor.
Right. That was just a little side, but the show was ultimately canned, and this is interesting because the Green Hornet was played a little straighter, according to Thomas, than Batman. And the kids loved, apparently, the Green Hornet, but the adults were like, this is too unbelievably real or something like that. So we wanted the campy Batman. So like, because the Green Hornet it tried to be a little more realistic, but like it was just almost unbelievable to like adult audiences at the time. And they went for the campier punch in the face. Wham! Batman. No. And they, that was the end of the show. But I mean, for a while, Bruce was able to earn a little bit of money, get that money trickling in from, basically stuff that was associated with Kato. But it wasn't a ton of money. But, one important thing that he starts to develop at this time is also his
signature fighting style.
Yeah, he moves away from, he started challenging tradition a lot more, and, he really kind of makes a full break with Wing Chun.
Yeah, and my impression from like reading this was sort of that Bruce had kind of decided that he had, I don't know if evolved is the right word, but he had moved so far away that what he was doing was no longer Kung Fu. Like he had incorporated so many different aspects of other martial arts and street fighting and like all that stuff that he couldn't say that what I'm teaching you is kung fu, because it's not.
And that's the thing. He had this very interesting relationship with the idea of like creating this new style, because a lot of people talk about like, hey, Jeet Kun Do, it's Bruce Lee's style, but he expressed a lot of regret about producing something that could be seen as like a new style, because that's not necessarily what he was pursuing. So if you read the progression of the books that John Little produces, you get an idea of this like progression that Bruce Lee had, where you went from practicing kung fu to practicing Jeet Kun Do to what he would call expressing the human body, which was like the higher level of enlightenment. And the reason that he had reservations about something being called a new style was that he saw it as basically, one style doesn't fit everyone. You have to develop tools that fit who you are. It was like, if he was going to teach you, he wasn't just teaching you to do what he did. You needed to learn to maximize what you could do.
And also, it seems like and I haven't read the John Little stuff, but it seems like just from what I have read and especially from this book, that his whole thing was not necessarily about a particular martial art. This is what you need to do to win a fight, and maximizing your ability to win a specific fight at any time.
Yeah. And that was on an individual basis. Like, he had his way of like, hey, this is what I need to do to make sure that like, I'm not trying to win competitions per se.
Yeah. And also, when you watch his movies, it's super flashy and stuff like that, but like that's not what Jeet Kune Do was. It was about it was like an economy of movement that I'm going to do the most damage with the least amount of energy expenditure, and it was a lot about attacking and countering at the same time with the same movement. Actually, Jeet Kune Do, it translates to intercepting fist, doesn't it?
Yeah. So like the way that it breaks down, the intercepting fist, or in Chinese, in Mandarin, it would be like Jie Chuan Dao, and it just means it's like the interrupting of the enemy's attack. His philosophy was that the best time for me to attack you is in the midst of your attack. And he picked that up from fencing.
Yeah.
So a lot of what he would do, like sometimes it revolved around using what he would say is his longest weapon against your nearest target. So like, in order to hit me, you have to move to me. So as that opponent comes in, he'll try to deliver like a low kick to the knee. And you think about it like, in MMA, sometimes they use that straight kick to the knee, and a lot of people get kind of villainized for it because that could potentially be a career-ending kick. Like John Jones used to get dogged because he would deliver that kick, and it's weird because he'd deliver it not from his lead leg, but from his back leg, kick straight, and actually sometimes from the lead leg, but kick straight to the knee. When he did that against Rampage, it's like, dude, that can be it for a fighter. And that's the way he trained it. And his philosophy, so basically, if you ever see Bruce Lee's symbol for Jeet Kun Do, it's like a yin-yang, and then on the outside, there's Chinese characters. And if you read the Chinese, it's really beautiful. So like the characters read, in Mandarin, it's Yi Wu Fa, Wei You Fa. And then the back half is Yi Wu Xian, Wei You Xian, which means to use no kind of way as the way, and like no law as the law. So it was basically just about like developing with no restrictions in terms of what you train. You train the most useful stuff for you. You don't have that dogma of like the karate guy does it this way. It's basically you do what's effective, and you don't limit yourself to, certain conventions. And this is what I was talking about in earlier episodes about him looking at other martial arts and taking what he thought was the most effective from those. So basically, if you read the notes, he's borrowing stuff from wrestling, jiu-jitsu, judo, and all that stuff. And he's taking notes about what works and what didn't work. And as we mentioned before, like with the wrestling, he's like, I don't want the legal holds. I want the illegal stuff that I shouldn't be using, the eye gouges, and all that stuff. So it was a different type of fighting style that borrowed on a lot of things. And this is kind of the time when he produces that.
Yeah, and I know we've talked about it before, but I just think it's important to emphasize that this was not a martial art that was meant to be tailored to a sport. This was about finishing a fight, and finishing a fight quickly and violently.
Yeah, and that's the kind of interesting thing, too, is that he did pick up a lot of, and we'll get onto this later, a lot of like big-name students in. Some of them happened to be celebrities, and some of them were sport fighters. You know, Chuck Norris was one of them, and another one was Joe Louis. And this is not Joe Louis the boxer.
Not that Joe Louis.
This is Joe Louis, the champion kickboxer. And they were really good fighters in their time. And Joe Louis had an interesting relationship with Bruce. Bruce wanted him to be in some films, but he never wanted to be like the guy that Bruce just beat up.
Yeah.
But like Joe Louis, he had a big fight against this guy a little bit later, and Joe ends up using some of these techniques that he had learned from Bruce, and he beats this guy whose name I can't remember at the moment. But I watched actually the fight.
History remembers the victors, Melvin.
And these guys were jacked. But he says, he credits, a lot of what Bruce taught him is helping him win that fight. So it was an interesting and useful way to train. Yeah, during this time, he's got to earn some more money, after the Green Hornet kind of closes down, So what does he go back to? He falls back on...
Cha-cha. No, he opens a third school. This time he opens it in L.A., in Chinatown. He would take you on as a student, but like you had to be committed and you had to show some talent. Bruce was not about taking someone who was a bumbling fool or something like that and trying to transform them into a fighter. You had to show that you, were super committed and also could actually do this stuff.
Yeah, so it wasn't necessarily easy to become a student at one of Bruce's schools. And in fact, he would put his students on a tailored, not his, but a one that's tailored to the students, like a physical fitness routine. So if you're like a bulky guy or something like that, maybe you'd say you got to do all this running.
You're fat. Go get less fat.
If you were a really skinny guy, maybe he'd get you on the weights. So that was what it centered on, and he also stressed like discipline. And one thing that we talk about is some of these icons not quite being they're humans at the end of the day. Like we've learned with Steve Jobs and some of the other guys that we cover, they had their flaws, man. And this is where you see one of Bruce's major flaws come out.
Yeah, and we've already talked about the fact that Bruce was quite a hothead, and this really is illustrated in an incident when he and some friends, two Dans, Inosanto and Lee, are hanging out at Bruce's. I think it was at Bruce's apartment. They were at somebody's apartment.
Yeah, they were in some kitchen somewhere.
Yeah, and they were just hanging out because we've also talked about the fact that a lot of Bruce's students became his friends, and
right.
And these guys were all friends, and they're doing what dudes do in some cases, and just found some boxing gloves and were just messing around with each other. And as it usually happens, it gets a little more intense than it was supposed to. And in this instance, Dan Lee slips a quote unquote lucky punch and lands it pretty hard on Bruce, and Bruce responds by beating the crap out of Dan to the point where he broke his jaw. And like the way it's described in the book was that like he hit him like 3 or 4 times before he even hit the ground. Just totally messed up his jaw. And Dan is quoted in the book as saying, like this incident happened a long time ago, and like we moved past it pretty quickly and that sort of thing. But that's just a very illustrative of the point that he
was a hothead.
Yeah, big time. With
and
friends and students.
And I don't even think the punch was described as being a very hard punch. It was just the fact that you managed to get a punch in on me, and now I'm furious.
Yeah.
And guy slips a punch in, Bruce just takes it and then breaks his student, remind you, breaks his student's jaw. So Bruce was a little bit of a hothead, a lot bit of a hothead. But at this time, he's taking on a lot of students. And he actually starts to take on some famous students. He's got the gravitas, the accolades from playing Kato. So everyone knows that, there's this kung fu guy, rolling around L.A. So he gets a number of famous students. Just to name a few, he gets Steve McQueen, Joe Louis, not the boxer, which we've already mentioned, Mike Stone, Chuck Norris, and James Coburn. And to raise a little bit more money, he starts to charge more.
For private lessons.
And, he was doing a lot of private lessons at this time.
Yeah, Steve McQueen ain't just rolling up to class.
Right. So for private lessons, he's charging $50 an hour. Which you think, late 1960s?
It's a lot of money.
That's pretty good. You could do a lot worse than that. And, he's still experimenting, mixing styles and practicing Jeet Kun Do. But, this also marks a really big change in his worldview and outlook. And that's where he kind of moves away from the idea of, I'm going to bring Kung Fu to the masses by having a chain of martial arts schools. He realizes, okay, if I'm going to deliver martial arts, this Kung Fu, what I do, Jeet Kun Do, it needs to be brought to them in a different medium. He can't teach everyone. And that's basically what he learns during this time. He can't do one-on-one lessons with everyone that wants to learn. So he realizes, I need to produce films and bring it to the people that way.
Yeah. And so he starts to try to leverage some of the connections that he's making through these celebrity students. And there was one guy in particular who was like a really successful screenwriter and producer named Sterling Siliphant. And that's probably not how I actually say his last name, but that's what I'm going with. And I believe they met because he just wanted to take lessons. And
yeah,
it was funny because the author describes in the book that at first Bruce was like, kind of like an eye roll type deal because he was older than he
was 50 when he came to learn.
He was older than Bruce was expecting him to be, and he didn't look particularly athletic, but Bruce didn't realize that, Sterling had been a martial artist in the past, and I think he was like a pretty accomplished fencer or something like that too.
Yeah.
And so they end up getting along, and really Sterling becomes really important for Bruce and in promoting Bruce's career.
Yeah, so, when they meet, like, Sterling he's 50, he's semi-retired, living in Bangkok, which I don't know how he hears about Bruce. Well, actually, no, we know how. He hears about Bruce basically because certain rumors are getting around the Hollywood circles. Bruce supposedly beat up some bodyguards that belonged to Vic Damone, who is a singer, pretty big singer at the time. Bruce beat up 2 of his bodyguards in a hotel suite in Las Vegas. Whether or not this actually happened, it's hard to say.
Yeah, I mean, the legend is that like Bruce like blew a door off the thing, and like he told him what was going to happen, and then he comes through, knocks one dude out with a door, and then kicks a cigarette out of one other guy's mouth or something like that.
Yeah, it was like he told the guy, like, I'm going to come in here and beat both of you up. And, Vic Damone's like, right, like, you see this bodyguard? And he, Bruce tells him, like, yeah, just wait right here by the door. I'll be right back in. And he just supposedly kicked the door off the hinges, which I guess is a good way to drop one guy. And then he dispatches the other bodyguard. So that's how Sterling heard about him, and, he wanted to be a student. And Bruce, at the time, like Arif said, Sterling helps him kind of get his career off the ground, and he gets a few bit parts between 1968 and 1969. Nothing big, but throughout all of this, he has to lean on his contacts, and especially Sterling, to get this work done. He's in a film called Marlowe, Ironsides, another one, like a show called Blondie, which I have not seen or heard any of these shows.
And it's important too to emphasize that Sterling, while not only looking out for Bruce in terms of finding him little bit parts, like there were scripts and stuff that he would work on, and he would write characters in for Bruce.
Yeah, specifically for Bruce, which is kind of remarkable. But one thing that this really underscores is that the nature of Bruce's work during this time, not real steady. It was just get what you can get, and hopefully maybe Sterling can scare up some work. So things are not great, I guess. But Bruce is thinking like, hey man, I got these Hollywood friends. I need to move in where they're at, like I need to be a big, if I'm going to make it, I got to live with the people that make it.
Bruce had a taste for the finer things in life.
And this is where we get into the money stuff. We alluded a little earlier, maybe in a past episode, that Bruce was not exactly the best when it came to managing the money. I'm not going to say he's bad.
He just liked flashy things. He was famous for wearing like silk suits and driving fancy cars and all this stuff. And so he decides that, on this not steady income, that he and Linda should move into a nicer neighborhood, into a house that they definitely couldn't afford. And this house, A, they couldn't afford to begin with. B, it needed some work, and they didn't have really the money to do the work. And in fact, Bruce kind of gets this windfall of cash from a sale of some property that his father had owned. And so his mother sends him the money. And so it's like, oh, we can repair the house. But Bruce is like, oh, I can buy a Porsche.
He's got to look the part if he's going to be a star.
No,
man.
He's got to be responsible for his family.
Yeah, so, at this time, they really start to kind of fall on hard times. As a matter of fact, to make matters even more absurd, Linda's pregnant with their second child, which will soon be born, and this adds to Bruce's desperation in terms
pressure.
Of how he needs to make it. And keep in mind that he's pretty much fully devoted to getting a movie role, but he just can't seem to land one.
Yeah, he really wants to get a solid role for himself that is going to provide some financial security. But also, Bruce was a writer, and he had ideas of his own that he would like to have made. And one film that he had sort of developed that, according to Bruce Thomas, it was based on like a recurring dream that he kept having, and it was called The Silent Flute. So he approaches Sterling Siliphant about writing the script for this, and he's kind of skeptical, but Bruce is like, listen, if we can just get a big actor attached to it, the studios will make it. So he goes to Steve McQueen and he tries to get McQueen on board, and this is kind of like cold to me, but I sort of understand what he's saying. But McQueen allegedly responds to him. He's like, I'm not here to make Bruce Lee famous.
Yeah, like Bruce definitely designed or thought about The Silent Flute as his break into the movies, and what he needed was he needed people to help him make that break. And Sterling was obviously kind of reluctant, and I think they passed around some scripts that were just trash, and then Siliphant finally agreed, like, listen, man, I'll sit down and help you write this. But Steve McQueen And the quote is, "I like you, but I'm not here to make you a star. I'm not going to carry you on my back." And this really kind of challenged Bruce. Like, Bruce was like, no. I'm going to be bigger than he is. Like, screw that guy. He had this like kind of kept repeating to himself, I'm going to be a bigger star than he is someday. And he really pushed for that.
Yeah.
And right after this disappointment, his daughter's born, Shannon, in April of 1969. With the new child, all of this stuff is going on. Sterling can see that Bruce is becoming increasingly desperate.
And agitated.
Right. So Bruce is bordering on the desperate, like, man, you need to help me out. Like, help me. And that's when Warner Bros. Finally is like, hey, we'll toss you a bone.
Yeah, I thought this was funny because, well, first of all, I think by this point, they had also got Coburn to sign
James
on.
Coburn.
So they at least had a known actor who had decided that he would be part of the film. And so they approached Warner Brothers and they were like, we can make this movie, but it has to be shot in India because we had made some money in India that we weren't allowed to take out.
Right. So this is basically the worst deal that you could possibly come down with. Like, listen, you can make a movie, but
this is your budget, and this is the only reason why.
And this needs to be in India. So they fly out to India and start scouting locations. And this is tough because Coburn and Siliphant can see the infrastructure that they need to make the film is not here. And to make matters worse, Bruce is dealing with a debilitating back injury. Before he had left, and this kind of added to his desperation, he had injured himself while working out in the morning. He damaged the sacral nerve in his back, and he, spent a few days applying heat and massages to it, and it did not get better. So he realized, like, I got to go see a doc, and the doc's like, man, your back's messed up. And the doctor recommends complete bed rest.
Because this is not, like it hurts when I twist or whatever. Like, he couldn't move. And, like, he was having, like, back spasms to the point where, like, he was, like, completely frozen.
Oh, yeah. And this goes out to anybody who's ever had a back injury. Like, it is debilitating. And he was stuck in bed for a while. I mean, imagine this guy who's used to training. He seemingly trained like a fighter that was preparing for a fight, just kind of like 24/7.
Always.
And he's got this back injury that's not getting better. So that was adding to his desperation before they got the deal to go out to India. But now they find themselves in India, and they're traveling all over India. And obviously in some tough circumstances, cars without AC or something like that.
Cars without AC on roads.
On rough roads.
On roads that are real bumpy.
So you've got
somebody with a hurt back to be sitting in all day.
Right. You've got Bruce's jacked up back, and now you've got James Coburn and Sterling who are like, this isn't working. So they're becoming increasingly agitated, and they're just kind of clashing a little bit left and right as they're trying to scout these locations. And I think they're moving in two different directions as Bruce is becoming more and more invested in, like, man, we can make this movie. And then the other two are like,
we can't make
this movie. And things really come to a head when James, for Bruce, ultimately James will pull out and say, like, man, I'm not making this film. It can't be done. But they run into a problem when they end up at this hotel, and Bruce is put in like a water closet. He's put in like a little room that's barely big enough to fit the bed, and they break out the presidential suite for James Coburn. And Lee took this as an affront, and he, like he did with Steve McQueen, it's like, I'm gonna be bigger than he is. Yeah. And those, like, Steve McQueen and James Coburn were the driving force behind a lot of, I would say, behind a lot of Bruce Lee's success, because he was like, I'm gonna be bigger than those guys, and I'm not settling for anything less.
Yeah, but I mean, it's also important to point out that they were also his friends. They were clashing and they would get into it over stuff, but like they were also friends at this point. And so Bruce, as we'll come to see, has this tendency to burn bridges. And in a lot of cases, they were with like people who legitimately cared about him and had helped him along the way.
Yeah, I mean, this is what's tough is these guys are his friends and he needs to rely on them, but there's limits.
Yeah.
Right?
He's also, I mean, I don't know if jealous is the right word, but it's like such a competitive aspect of Bruce's personality that, like, again, it goes back to like not being able to lose at anything. That when he decides that you are offending me or something like that, that I have to beat you and I have to beat you at your game. And, you're huge actors. I'm going to be a huge actor and I'm going to throw it in your face.
Right. At this point in time, things don't go well. Siliphant and Coburn leave India, leaving Bruce, who's kind of still driving around trying to like scout locations for this movie that nobody else has really bought in on yet. And things are not looking good at home.
Bruce was a very proud guy, and he really didn't like the idea that Linda may have to go back to work. And she did. She ended up getting like a minimum wage job working like second shift, which props to her because she spent the day taking care of the kids. And then Bruce would come home from, teaching classes or training and that sort of thing, and he would get them dinner and put them to bed, but she was out the door to go work until, 11 p.m. and then come back and do it all again the next day.
Yeah, I mean, she was working herself ragged. And I think, Bruce Thomas points out that Linda's health even started to suffer.
Yeah.
She was working that hard. And that's the tough thing is Bruce is really desperate. He's injured, trying to find a movie role. And Linda is, forced into working, which for Bruce, like Arif said, you're failing as a father and as a husband, and your wife has to go make money for the family. And this is a time, where like husbands worked and, a lot of times the wives were expected to just take care of the family. So it hurt Bruce that he couldn't.
That's also the model that Bruce had grown up in. And so there's that aspect as well.
Yeah. So we talked about kind of how he relied on his friends and how they were limits to their friendship. But Siliphant was actually, still...
He was always looking out for Bruce.
Right. So he would just write scripts for Bruce to just go ahead and like, hey, you know what? You need some money. You need some work. Let me write you a script. So there was a show called Longstreet that they were producing, and Siliphant wrote a role for Bruce in this show where he's pretty much playing himself. Basically, Bruce is a martial arts instructor in the show, and I don't even know if he's an instructor, but he's a martial artist in the show.
Yeah, because Longstreet was like a detective thing.
Yeah, he was like a blind guy that witnessed a murder.
Yeah, so I believe, if I recall correctly, the overall plot of the show, that the star of it was a blind detective who had been present for some murder or some crime, but wasn't able to ID the guy because, he's blind. And he's somehow led to Bruce's character.
Well, yeah, the thugs that had killed the guy were going to toss him overboard on the ship, and Bruce shows up and defeats the guy, and then, Longstreet's like, hey, man, how'd you do that? Why don't you teach me all this kung fu stuff that you did?
That stuff sounded really cool.
Oh, my God. So basically, Bruce imparts some knowledge, and although he is initially reluctant, but he teaches the guy some martial arts stuff. And again, kind of like the Green Hornet, this episode with Bruce produced most of the fan mail for the show. So it was a big point for Bruce. And at that time, what he ends up doing is he decides, I'm gonna head back to Hong Kong for a little bit.
I'm taking Brandon.
Yeah, let me take my son and fly back to the Mecca. And he shows up in Hong Kong, and to his shock and surprise, pleasant surprise, he gets off the plane, and there are people everywhere. Yeah. Cameras flashing. He gets a star's welcome in Hong Kong. And this is just completely surprising. Yeah,
and it's funny to think of now because Bruce effectively gets to Hong Kong and realizes that he's become a star for his role in Green Hornet. But like, it's funny to think of now that that could never happen. Like, there's no way that you would be like overseas or whatever and not realize that you would become extremely popular anywhere because of, the advent of Twitter and all that stuff.
Yeah, so Warner Brothers had taken the Green Hornet and they were like, we need to wring out a little more money.
Squeeze it.
From this. And they start showing it in Hong Kong and I think in Singapore and maybe some other parts of South Asia. And they really kind of make Bruce into a star. And they have no idea that this is happening. So the show is obviously about the Green Hornet, but in Hong Kong, it's about Kato.
It's about Kato.
Everybody loves Kato. So Bruce gets off the plane and realizes, holy crap, I'm the man out here. I ain't going nowhere. And we need to parlay this into some good things happening. So who does he contact? He contacts his good buddy Unicorn and says, listen, man, I don't know how you didn't tell me about this, but I got a little buzz out here. So I need you to run over to the Shaw Brothers, which at the time, the Shaw Brothers is a film company. It's the biggest film company outside of the United States and outside of Europe. They made it was something crazy, like 60% of the martial art, like the films in China.
It was ridiculous. And it's also important to mention that Hong Kong was like the place for Chinese film.
Yeah, it still is. All of the big martial arts stars that we think about today, they cut their teeth working in the Hong Kong film circuit. Jackie Chan, Jet Li, they came through that Hong Kong circuit. And at the time, Shaw Brothers was the biggest thing. Yeah. And the head of that was this guy named Run Run Shaw. They have some really interesting names. There's like 3 Shaw Brothers, but Run Run was the one who really kind of ran the show. And, Bruce leaves it to Unicorn. He gives him some paperwork and says, go over to Run Run and let him know I'm interested in making some films. And, Bruce from there goes back home and shoots, some more episodes of Longstreet. But in the meantime, some stuff starts happening in Hong Kong that would be very important for Bruce's career. Now, Run Run Shaw offers Bruce basically, he says like, okay, yeah, Bruce has got a little bit, but like a little buzz. I'll offer him a regular junior contract, which is a 7-year contract at I think like $2,000 a film.
Yeah, not a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, but it's honestly money that Bruce probably could have used.
Oh, for sure. Like
at the time,
he wasn't in position to say no to it. But I mean, in terms
which is what he did.
Yeah, but like for movie star money, that was not a lot of money.
Yeah, so I mean, movies in Hong Kong, in China, were very different. Yeah. Now we talked about, I think, in episode 1, the tradition of the Chinese opera. And this filtered into the way that they produced movies. So, like, I think a lot of those opera troupes, the way they ran those ran into how they produced movies. So they would contract individuals out for a certain number of years, certain number of movies, and they weren't really paid a whole lot of money. And the movies for the Shaw Brothers, you know, they were made at about $100,000 a film, and they pumped these bad boys out. They had to produce dozens of movies in a year.
It's funny to think about too that how much different in budget you would have between one of these movies and like a movie that Bruce was trying to get made in the US, but also because of those low budgets, like they didn't have prop stuff. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like there was a difference. They had stunt doubles and stuff, but those stunt doubles were getting hit over the head with real glass bottles and like real chairs. Yeah. You know what I mean? And when someone fell off a building or whatever, there wasn't necessarily an airbag waiting for them. Like,
yeah, that was the interesting thing that you start to see is that, and we'll get into this more later, is like films were just produced differently in East Asia. And obviously, when you think about it, $100,000 film budget, and then you film it in like a week, and you shoot between midnight and 5 a.m. because Hong Kong's a busy, bustling place. And if you needed to be quiet to shoot a film, which, you know, another thing about the films is a lot of them were recorded without the sound. Yeah. They're like, look, we'll add the sound later. Yeah. It's not that important right now. So it was just a very different film tradition. And if you're not used to watching films from Hong Kong, especially in those days, the 60s and early 70s, well, we say pre-Bruce, they were acted very differently. The acting leaned on some of that Chinese tradition. So he ends up leaving Hong Kong, shoots some stuff for Longstreet, and leaves basically all this information and leaves it up to Unicorn to make the rest of this happen. Now, what happens over at Shaw Brothers is what's really important for Bruce's career. There was a senior executive at Shaw Brothers named Raymond Chow. And Chow, you know, obviously worked for Run Run Shaw. What ends up happening is Chow, he's a proud guy. And Run Run is really enamored with this young lady on the team. And what ends up happening is Run Run elevates this woman, Mona Fong, above Chow. And Run Run's like, listen, I've been in the company for how long? And you're going to take some random hussy off the street and put her in a position that's higher than the one that I'm in. And she may have been a former actress, but I can't quite recall. So Raymond Chow does what any spiteful individual would do. He quits the film company and starts his own, which becomes the now legendary Golden Harvest Films. So with the new film company, he needs a cash cow. And he hears that Bruce Lee is interested in making films in Hong Kong. So he goes to work about poaching Bruce Lee and getting him out to Hong Kong. Now, it's important to stick with one of the themes of our show, people passing on really great opportunities. As we mentioned before, that Run Run had offered Bruce a pretty standard junior salary, and it was like, not going to do it. But Raymond Chow saw something special in Bruce and went about bringing him on board. He offered Bruce really just a little bit more than Run Run was willing to offer him. He offered him a 2-film deal at, I think, $15K. Yeah. So, you know, $17.5 per movie. Yeah, I mean, $7.5 per movie.
Yeah, and I mean, it's definitely more than he was going to get at Shaw Brothers.
Right. And the film that he gets brought on to make is a film now known as Big Boss, or at the time known as Big Boss. And, Arif, where was the film made?
So they traveled to Thailand, actually, to film Big Boss. So in Thailand, it was pretty frustrating for Bruce, even though, you know, Big Boss ends up being a major success. But like the actual filming process and that sort of stuff was very frustrating for him. But while he was experiencing these frustrations, Longstreet was airing in the US and it was very popular. And so Paramount gets a hold of him and locks him down to do more episodes. And like I said, Big Boss explodes.
Yeah, so, you know, he's dealing with these rough conditions in Thailand to film the movie. And basically the plot of Big Boss is Bruce plays the role of a character known as Chen Chaoan. And he's falls into this sort of archetype that Bruce is often cast in during this time as the Chinese country bumpkin. He moves or ends up in Thailand to work with these other Chinese migrant workers, and he's kind of sworn off fighting. And what they realize is he works for this, like, him and his friends and family work for this, like, ice company.
Yeah, they work for the big boss. He owns this ice company, and it becomes apparent quickly that he is using this company as a front to sell drugs. But I wanted to interject because I think it's important to note that, especially at this time, there's this theme that kind of runs through these films of the working poor or like the working class rising up or standing up to these authority figures in like the form of a boss and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that image resonated with audiences in Hong Kong because obviously most of the people in Hong Kong are these kind of, they're these workers that, have to work for these, these big companies or more powerful individuals, and they kind of feel like they're, powerless at the bottom of these working structures. And Bruce tapped into that with the big boss, and he is just this country bumpkin trying to make a living, finds out that the guy he works for is smuggling drugs, and really he finds out because one of his friends or family members, I can't remember if they're family or friends, they find out, and the big boss has them killed, and they end up finding their bodies in these blocks of ice. So Chen ends up fighting Big Boss and his henchmen.
All he wanted to do was remain peaceful.
Right, but you know what? You can't sometimes. And he, in the end, defeats the Big Boss. There's obviously more plot points here, but it's this image of the country bumpkin defeating the Big Boss. And as Arif has already said, it releases in Hong Kong to rave reviews. So this is Bruce's first big film. So Linda's there. They're there for the premiere at midnight. And, this scene is depicted in the Dragon movie that comes out in the 90s where, Linda and Bruce are like waiting and just expecting to get like booed out of the movie theater. And suddenly there's just cheers. And the movie is an absolute box office success in Hong Kong. The film was shot for $100,000, which is the usual run for a film at this time in Hong Kong, but it smashes local box office records and brings in 3 million Hong Kong dollars. And at this point in time, this is when Run Run Shaw realizes, I screwed up.
Oh, yeah.
And he says, to me at the time, Bruce Lee was just another actor. How could I have known? And that missed opportunity for Shaw Brothers turns out to be the greatest lifeline that's going to be thrown to Golden Harvest Films.
Yeah.
And,
really. They've got Bruce.
Yeah, they landed Bruce, and Bruce was the action star of the future. And, that's where we'll end off this episode. So we've seen Bruce grow from being a brash young man.
Yeah, and, when we started this episode, he was really just trying to break into the film industry. And with the success of Longstreet and The Big Boss, we're leaving off with Bruce. Like, he had completely arrived by this point. Like, he was looked at, especially in Hong Kong, as like the future of action films, and he was getting a little bit of attention in the U.S. too.
Yeah, so I mean, he's blowing up in Hong Kong, and there's kind of rumblings in the U.S., but he's really only a star in Hong Kong. But you know what? He's made it somewhere, and now he just needs to parlay that into bigger success. So we'll see how he does.
Yeah, and we will pick up there next week. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you then.
Hey, before we take off, I just want to remind you guys how you can support the show. First, you can rate, review, and tell a friend, and also follow us on social media.
Especially Twitter. We're at the Life of X Podcast. Additionally, you can head over to lifeofxpodcast.com/support, where you will find portals to audible.com, amazon.com, and patreon.com. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Audible is a gigantic and wonderful audiobook website. You can receive a free audiobook when you sign up through our website. You go through our Amazon portal. Any purchases that you make, Amazon kicks us a small percentage of that. And finally, you can head over to our Patreon page where you can sign up to make a contribution to the show on a per episode basis. We appreciate your support. Thank you.